everybody. Good to have you here today. About a year ago, the editor of the Star Tribune's Outdoors section asked me if I wanted to interview a Minnesota author, John Slaght, who had written an intriguing sounding book on big Russian fish-eating owls. The book was called Owls of the Eastern Ice, a quest to find and save the world's largest owl. I was sent an advanced copy. The book hadn't been released yet, and I soon discovered it was a most remarkable book. First of all, it was the best account of winter field research that I ever read, but it was so much more. It was a travelogue of an area of the world so little known that I couldn't use Google Maps to find out where he was. And it was an engaging depiction of the quirky community that lives in that remote and challenging landscape. Owls of the Eastern Ice has since garnered national accolades. It was longlisted for a National Book Award and labeled a New York Times Notable Book of 2020. The Wall Street Journal named it one of the top 10 best books of 2020, and it's up for a 2021 PEN America Award for literary science writing. Recently, it became a finalist for a Minnesota Book Award nonfiction category. I am pleased to introduce this author, John Slaght. John came to Minnesota to take a master's degree in wildlife biology at the University of Minnesota under Francie Cuthbert and stayed for his doctorate under Rocky Gutierrez. His master's was a survey of birds of the Russian Far East and served to prime the pump for his doctoral work on Blakiston fish owls, which you will hear about soon. John learned how to handle big owls by practicing on great horned owls at the U's Raptor Center. He stayed on in Minnesota after his degree and now lives with his family in South Minneapolis near Lake Nokomis. But his job takes him far from here as he serves as the Russia and Northeast Asia coordinator for the Wildlife Conservation Society, at least in non-COVID times. Please welcome John. You're in for a special treat.
Thanks, Sue, so much for that introduction and for the invitation to speak tonight. I will say, I received a very nice letter from Sue early on. I guess this was after the editor had sent her the book to review. And she wrote me this nice note that said, you know what, I think this book's going to be big. And, you know, it was very nice to read that, of course, but also, of course, I didn't believe her. I'm just astounded by the level of attention that this has received, but Sue knew it. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk tonight about the book and give you more information about sort of the area where the book takes place. And this is a relatively casual conversation, I'd like to think. And if you do have questions that come up, as was mentioned, please put them in the chat, and then we'll get to them at the end. So yeah, here's the book. It's coming out in paperback in June. So if you haven't picked it up yet and want to wait a little bit, the paperback will be out pretty soon. So it's a book about a pretty remarkable owl. I mean, they're just enormous birds. I mean, females exceed 11 pounds. They have these 6-foot wingspans, and they stand about as tall as a fire hydrant. But I think part of the book's appeal is that it's not just a book about owls. It's also very much a book about people and the people who live in the forest with these owls. And it's also very much a story about field work. I mean, the triumphs and the failures that go into field research. So before I get into the details about what happens in the book and my work with these owls, I do want to step back for a second and kind of describe the area that this work takes place in, describe some of the other species found there, just to show you that this isn't just one remarkable bird in an otherwise mundane corner of the world, but it's just one component of a vibrant and exotic place. So this work takes place, the story takes place in a province of Russia called Primordia, or Primorsky Krai, which is all the way out there. It is only 1% of Russia's total territory, and it's where I go is a village called Ternay, which is at 45 degrees latitude. So I mean, that's the same as Minneapolis. Overall, the region is fairly mountainous and sparsely populated. There's about 2 million people in the whole province, half of whom live just in the capital city of Vladivostok. And the rest of the province is largely dotted with smaller villages where populations are measured in the thousands, the hundreds, and in some cases even the dozens. And given this mountainous landscape, these human settlements are really kind of tucked where they can fit between the mountains and other geographical features such as rivers or the coast. It's a rustic life here outside of cities. People live in these typically one-story wooden homes. They heat their homes with wood. There's typically a big diesel generator somewhere that provides electricity for the town. They get their water from the river, from wells, and they get their meat, their protein from the forest, hunting deer, hunting boar, and from the rivers and the oceans, fishing. So the province is largely defined by the Sekretari Mountains. They cover almost the entire area. And if you're familiar with the Appalachians in the American East, it's sort of like that, just this really long, rolling, relatively low rolling mountain chain. The coastline here is just spectacular. Many people have this mental image of Russia that doesn't involve sandy beaches and crystal clear water. But hey, this is Primordia. This is the western shores of the Sea of Japan. Probably the most famous resident in the forest here is the Amur tiger, also called the Siberian tiger. And it's just one of several cats that live here. There's a number of subtropical species that extend the range north just to dip into Russia in Primordia. And you have these subtropical species sharing the same forest with boreal species. I mean, there's lynx here, there's wolves, there's brown bears. In fact, this area is the only part of the world where you have brown bears and tigers sharing the same habitat. It's essentially like having two kings in one castle. They do sometimes fight and they do sometimes kill each other. But because this is a bird group, I do want to delve a little more into some of the avian diversity here, just to give you a flavor of what you can see and what people see just sort of walking around. So you also have these more northern species, things that we're familiar with. So things like northern ravens and redpolls, mixed in with more exotic looking things. This is a temperate species, the mandarin duck, closely related to the wood duck. Then we also get things like spoonbill sandpipers, one of the most endangered shorebird species in the world. They don't breed here; they breed in the Russian Arctic, but they stop over on their way to Southeast Asia for the winter. And I can't talk about Primordia and birds without getting into Lake Hanka, which is this enormous 4,000 square kilometer lake that shares a border actually with China. And if you look at the relief there, you can see it's pretty flat. So as you move away from the mountains, you move west, you hit these lowlands. And the landscape just gets wetter and wetter and wetter until you get to the lake. And in some places like here, you can't even really define where the edge of the lake is. So it's this massive lowland wetland complex, which is just ideal for migratory water birds in particular. It's one of the most important stopover sites on the East Asian Australasian Flyway, which is one of the major global flyways. I mean, just hundreds of thousands of birds pass through every year. There's a couple interesting breeders. There's Oriental white storks, an endangered species. These breed here. There's 3 species of crane that are found here. 2 of them breed. This is the red-crowned crane. There's also the white-naped crane. And then a species that doesn't breed here, but it comes through a migration, is the hooded crane. This is actually my favorite of the crane species. They're just small little guys, and they breed in these high elevation larch bogs. And in fact, I mentioned this at the start of the owl book, where I was trying to decide if I wanted to study fish owls or hooded cranes, and I ended up going with the owls. I don't regret that decision, but I'm still looking for someone else to study these birds because they're not very well known. Onto raptors, and there are some species that we're familiar with here, such as the golden eagle. These are images here taken from a camera trap set for tigers that instead caught a golden eagle riding a young cicada deer like a bronco. and ultimately the deer died, and then the eagle ate it. This was I was a co-author in a publication a few years ago on this. And then there's more exotic raptors. This is a oriental honey buzzard. So these guys spend a lot of time on the ground. Their primary prey source is the larvae of ground nesting wasps. So what they do is they follow wasps through the forest back to their nests and then dig them up. And it might be hard to tell, but these birds have extremely thick, almost very strong, almost armor-like plumage, especially around the eye. You can see how thick and dense that is. And it's very, very waxy. And so this is a defense, right? So as they're digging up these wasp nests, so that's a defense to prevent the wasps from stinging them. They're stellar sea eagles. This is the largest eagle species in the world. They don't breed in Primordia, but they do winter here. And every winter I'm over there, I see a number of these along the coast. And then just to get a sense of how, I mean, these are some tracks in the sand. That's a normal sized human hand. So they're just really, really, really big birds. An even bigger bird is the cinereous vulture there in the middle. To its left is, for scale, is a immature stellar sea eagle. And this, the cinereous vulture is an immature bird as well. They tend, a few hundred, like 400 to 600 of these birds winter in Primordia. They breed in Mongolia. And for some reason, this group of them comes to Primordia's coast where they feed off of deer carcasses in the winter. And then that leads us to the fish owl. The first time I saw one of these birds, it was in the year 2000, and I was in the Peace Corps in this village, kind of in the southern part of Primordia. I knew that there were fish owls in Primordia, but based on the information that I had, they were much further north, like sort of where that word Russia is in the middle. That's the Bikini River Basin, and that's really where the fish owls were known to be. I wasn't expecting to see one quite this far south. And I'm going to read you the first paragraph of the owl book, just to give you a flavor for that first encounter. I saw my first Blakiston's fish owl in the Russian province of Primordia, a coastal talon of land hooking south into the belly of Northeast Asia. This is a remote corner of the world, not far from where Russia, China, and North Korea meet in a tangle of mountains and barbed wire. On a hike in the forest there in 2000, a companion and I unexpectedly flushed an enormous and panicked bird. Taken to the air with labored flaps, it hooted its displeasure, then landed for a moment in the bare canopy perhaps a dozen meters above our heads. This disheveled mass of wood chip brown regarded us warily with electric yellow eyes. We were uncertain at first which bird actually we'd come across. It was clearly an owl, but bigger than any I'd seen, about the size of an eagle, but fluffier and more portly, with enormous ear tufts. Backlit by the hazy gray of a winter sky, it seemed almost too big and too comical to be a real bird, as if someone had hastily glued fistfuls of feathers to a yearling bear, then propped the dazed beast in the tree. So conveniently, I had my camera with me and took these pictures. So this is that bird that I just described to you. And so given how I really thought I was hundreds of kilometers away from where fish owls were, my brain didn't want to believe that's what I'd seen. I feel like we all have, as bird people, we all have these sort of almost mythical birds living in our heads, these grail birds that we really want to see. But you know, as pragmatic bird watchers, you always assume it's the common thing, and then kind of the process of deduction get to the rarer and rarer species. So that's what this was like for me. I'd assumed this was a Eurasian eagle owl, to be honest. And it took a few weeks for me to get the film developed. It was about a 4-hour bus ride each way to get to where I could develop film, because this was the pre-digital days. Finally being able to look at the photos, determined that it was in fact the Blakiston's fish owl. So we believe now that there are between 1,000 and 1,900 of these birds in the wild, or between 500 and 850 pairs. Most of these are on the Russian mainland. You can see Primordia down there at the bottom. But there's about 200 birds that live on the Japanese island of Hokkaido and some of the Russian Kuril islands, such as such as Kunish here. And this is I mean, you look at a scale bar in the lower left. I mean, this is Primordia up to the northern Sea of Ojotsk. That's a huge area, but they live at extremely low densities. So I think, even among owls, fish owls are pretty weird birds. And I'm going to go over a few reasons for why I think that is. So one common attribute that we all know about owls is how exceptional their hearing is. And we look at some of these other owl species. California spotted owls on the top, and a great horned owl from my neighborhood here in Minneapolis, and a boreal owl from Russia. They all have these just tremendous facial discs, and we all know, of course, that the function of that feather structure is to channel sound directly to the ear holes. If you look at a fish owl's face, I mean, yeah, sure, there's a little bit of a facial disc, maybe more like a harrier or something, but nowhere nearly as defined as many other owl species. Another attribute commonly attributed to owls is silent flight. And that's really facilitated also by feather structure. So we look at the primary flight feather of a Eurasian eagle owl. We see these barbules on the leading edge on the top there, these pokey comb-like protrusions sticking up. And the function of these essentially is when the owl flaps its wings, the air hits those barbules first and pushes the air away, reducing turbulence and friction, and allowing the owl to kind of cut through the air like a knife through butter. Let's look at a fish owl primary feather, and there's no barbules. In fact, fish owls can be pretty loud. If it's a quiet night and you've got an 11-pound bird pushing its way through the sky, I mean, you can hear that thing coming. So we think about why would fish owls have lost these owly attributes? So we think about what they're hunting and where they're hunting it. I mean, they're fish owls, right? They're eating fish. So my sense is that fish don't care if there's an owl flapping around in the canopy above. They can't hear it anyway. So that's just an attribute that fish owls lost. And then also they're hunting largely in these shallow, rocky, fast-moving waterways that are just inherently loud. When I'm over there surveying for fish owls, I move away from the river so I can hear better. So I feel like if the owls had the sensitive hearing of a great gray, for example, I think they'd go nuts from all the noise. So there are two features on the landscape that fish owls need to lead happy fish owl lives, and the first is really big trees. They're cavity nesters, they're non-migratory, and they need old growth trees, 200-300-year-old cottonwoods, elms, just something that gets big enough to provide a hole large enough for them to nest in. A few examples. Some of these can be pretty hard to get up to. Some are low. It really doesn't matter to them how high up the cavity is, as long as there's a cavity big enough. Then the other attribute the other landscape feature that they absolutely require is access to prey year-round. I mean, I mentioned they're non-migratory, yet they live in a place where the winter temperatures dip to the -30s. I mean, it's cold over there. And yet there are certain patches of rivers that are reliably ice-free year in and year out. There are a couple of different reasons for this, but an important one is hot springs, radon hot springs. And where this gas seeps into a river channel in these reliable places, it warms the water just enough to prevent it from freezing. And so these areas remain ice-free year in and year out. So historically, over time, I mean, there's been essentially almost no conflict or potential conflict between the needs of humans for these big trees and fish-rich rivers and the fish owls. These images here are from indigenous Udege about 100 years ago. And they would catch fish owls in autumn when the birds would put on these really thick fat reserves in anticipation of a long cold winter. And so they target them so they could eat these big fatty birds. And then they would also spread out their wings and their tails to use as fans. You can see from the bottom right there to dissipate the clouds of biting insects in summer. And even until recently, there wasn't much conflict between the needs of humans and fish owls. This map here shows just Ternay County in Primordia, which is the northernmost county and where most of the book takes place. And so even as recently as 1984, there were almost no roads. And of course, roads concentrate human use. And this is all great fish owl habitat here, as I know now. And So essentially, with no roads, there really aren't going to be that many people. Fast forward 20 years to 2005, and boom, there's this huge explosion of roads. You go from fewer than 150 miles of road to about 3,000 miles of road in this relatively short period of time. Now, despite this sudden emergence of threats, there were no plans to mitigate these problems, at least for fish owls. This is an endangered species. It's considered so by Russian law. And Russian law dictates that the owls themselves and their habitat cannot be harmed or degraded. But if you don't know anything about the bird, you don't understand what its habitat needs are, there can be no conservation plan. And this is, I mentioned, it's a low density species. It's a very cryptic species. They're very, very shy. They don't really like to be observed by humans. But so without this baseline information about their needs, they're at risk of extinction here. So that was really the driving factor for this project, which was the basis for my PhD at the University of Minnesota. I teamed up with these two guys. They're both named Sergei Avdyuk and Sergei Sormich. Sormich is an ornithologist with the Russian Academy of Sciences, and he and his brother-in-law, Sergei Avdyuk, had spent about a decade prior to my involvement looking for fish owls, getting a basic sense of where they could find some. And so I had a meeting with these guys, and we agreed to team up with a plan to find some fish owls, catch them, put GPSs on their backs, and then use that data to understand what parts of the landscape are important, and then use that to create a conservation plan. So the project was broken into 3 parts, which correspond to the 3 different parts of the book. And the first part was a 2-week expedition to the northernmost settlement in the province. And it was, at the time, there were no roads leading there. You could only get there to the river drainage by boat up along the coast, and then by boat or snowmobile up the river, or flying into this hunting village by helicopters. This is actually, Sergei took this picture. This is me flying in to meet the team of 4 people total. And the idea was to snowmobile down the river, down the frozen river, 80 kilometers from that village to the coast, where a boat would meet us and take us south back to civilization, and then surveying for fish owls along the way. So yeah, we had 2 snowmobiles and these sleds jam-packed with everything we could. And for me, this was an extremely valuable experience. This was dipping my first toes into the fish owl waters, like understanding what to key in on in the landscape, what might be important for fish owls, and just how to look for a bird that really doesn't like to be found. And the most important thing to look for was tracks. Anytime we'd see some of these open water patches along a river, we'd get out the binoculars and look for tracks in the snow, because these birds walk more than most other owl species. They'll kind of walk along these open water patches looking for a good spot to wait and ambush for a fish. And then nest trees too. I mean, these really big trees are relatively rare on the landscape. So anytime we'd see one of these, again, you get out the binoculars, crane our necks, look for a cavity. Then if there is a cavity, maybe you try to look for some down hanging on the lip or something. And if it looks really promising, try to maybe get up there and see if it's a fish owl nest. So I had many nemeses throughout the years of this work, and my first nemesis was what's called a naled, which literally means on the ice. And so I'd mentioned how people use this river, the Samarga River, to travel between the 2 villages in the drainage. And people travel in winter on the frozen river on snowmobiles, and they travel in summer in boats. They typically don't travel in autumn, they don't travel in spring because of the unsafe conditions of the ice. As it turned out, a lot of this expedition happened to take place in early spring because of weather delays. And so a naled is where at some point upriver, water, because everything's melting, water flows up to the surface, flows across the surface, then disappears somewhere else downriver. But when you're just kind of careening toward one of these things on a snowmobile, you don't know if it's a naled that's only maybe an inch or 2 deep, or knee deep, or waist deep, or if that's actually open water, which is a little bit of crust on top. And if you hit that, you're going to go right to the bottom of the river. So here's us trying to get across one of these guys. So the longer we went on this expedition, the more of these we encountered. And there were places where, like here, they're relatively easy to get across. And there were some places where it was just impossible. And we actually had to get out chainsaws and cut a detour through the forest around the blockage to get back to solid ice. And at one point toward the end of this trip, we gave up on fish owl surveys and just gunned it for the coast because ice was just dropping into the river all around us. And we didn't want to be stranded, halfway between villages in the middle of nowhere. So that was late winter, early spring 2006, and then spring 2006 was the second part of the project, which was much more relaxed. Here it was just me and Sergey driving around that vast road network I showed you a map of earlier in his pickup truck, revisiting some sites that he and Sergey had found over the last decade, and looking for new fish owls, essentially trying to build a study population. So birds that we could catch and tag, which we would try to do the next winter. We'd stay in these random hunter cabins that we came across. A lot of hunters who have hunting territories here sometimes just leave their cabins unlocked because you never know who's going to come by and need a place where they can dry their clothes or have a roof over their heads. As you can look around, there's not a whole lot to steal here anyway, right? So it's nice to be able to know that you can have a warm place to sleep if you need it. And sometimes we stayed with friends of Sergey's. If anyone's read the book, this is Vova Volkov. There's an interesting story in the book about his dad getting lost at sea. And then in the off seasons, come back to Minneapolis, to St. Paul, take classes at the university. Sue mentioned that I trained in raptor handling and transmitter attachment at the University of Minnesota. Here's one of those great horned owls that I worked with there. These birds did not like me very much. They knew I was up to no good. But they were fairly accommodating and let me kind of poke at them and learn how to draw blood and take measurements and all that. And then in January 2007, I went back to Russia for the third and final component of the project, which was captures. And so this was winters 2007 and 2010. I kept returning to try to catch these birds and get information from them. I will say that January and February 2007 was an absolute low point of my life. Again, I was just with Sergey and in his pickup truck, and at first we were just sleeping in tents, and we're outside for weeks at a time, and it's freezing. And so we'd go to these sites where we'd found owls the year before. We'd identify the open water patches where we knew they were hunting, and we'd set out traps. Now, no one had really caught fish owls for science before, and so we didn't really know what kind of trap would work. So we were trying all these different things. Nothing was happening. We'd be up all night listening for the owls or hearing the owls hooting, but not getting caught. And we'd be up all day poking at our traps, trying to figure out why they weren't working. And we were just cold all the time. I remember one night, Sergey and I are lying awake inside this tent, and it was minus 30 something outside. And we were cinched into our mummy bags as tight as we could be. And I just had my nose sticking out so I could breathe a little bit. And it was so cold that our exhalations were actually freezing to the interior dome of the tent. And anytime one of us would shuffle a little bit, it would jiggle the tent and rain this fine mist of ice slivers down onto my nose. And it was just dreadful. And after a few weeks of this, Sergey ran into this guy in the middle of the forest. His name is Anatoly, and he's a hermit. He'd been living alone in the forest for about 10 years at this point. He occupied an abandoned hydroelectric station. And just as it turned out, his cabin here was right on the border between these two fish owl territories. So we'd hear a pair vocalizing here, a pair vocalizing there. And so these were birds we were trying to catch. And Anatoly was very gracious. He's like, look, why are you guys sleeping in a tent? Like, hey, I have a spare room here. Frankly, I could use the company. Why don't you stay with me? At least you'll have a roof over your heads. And so We still weren't catching owls, and it was still really cold, but we did at least have some warmth, and that really helped morale. But a lot of the time, we would just, Sergey and I would just be sitting around at a campfire in the dark, waiting for an owl to get caught. Typically, where we were catching owls was a few hundred, 200 to 500 meters away, usually from where we were staying. And so we had these trap transmitters. So a little beacon so if our trap got jiggled, a beacon would go off, and then we'd know that, like a radio signal. So then we had a receiver. So then we'd jump onto our skis and kind of like shuffle up the frozen river in the dark, looking for trying to get up to the trap. So I'm going to read 3 paragraphs, which is the first time we actually caught one of these owls. We approached the trap a few hundred meters away on skis. Up ahead, I saw Sergey's spotlight reveal an owl sitting on the bank, watching us. Like one of Jim Henson's darker creations, this was a goblin bird with mottled brown feathers puffed out, back hunched, and ear tufts erect and menacing. I'd seen other owl species adopt this posture in order to look bigger and more threatening to an aggressor, and it was working. This was a creature braced for battle. I was taken aback, and I still am every time I see one of these birds, by how enormous it was. The beast stood immobile, glaring at us with yellow eyes in the winter dark and illuminated unevenly by Sergey's light as our pace quickened. Everything was silent except for the rhythmic friction of skis on snow and our gasps of exhaustion. The urgency to reach the owl before it freed itself was palpable. My heart stopped as the fish owl pivoted and took to the air in retreat, but the weight of the trap held and drew the bird softly back to ground. The huge owl moved away from us with awkward bounds along the broad, snowy bank, dragging the trap with it until finally, when we were only meters away, the raptor spun onto its back on the river's edge. It lay there facing us, talons extended and agape, ready to shred any flesh within striking distance. In the off-season, I trained in raptor handling at the Raptor Center at the University of Minnesota, and had learned that hesitation with the defensive raptor doesn't do anyone any good. I swooped my arm in a fluid motion the moment I was within reach, scooping the bird up by its extended legs. Upside down and confused, the owl relaxed its wings, and I used my free arm to tuck them first against its body, and then the body against me as though holding a swaddled newborn child. The owl was ours. So that was after, like I said, after, I don't know, 4 or 6 weeks of abject failures at catching these birds, that we started to catch owls. And we ended up catching 4 in the period of about a week, it was becoming spring, water was melting, so the season was clearly ending. I had to take it back to the US. And I think 3 birds we ended up catching in just a few days. So we figured out a trap combination that worked, and it was quite effective. So this bird here, I'm about to release it, and I don't know, you probably can't see that. There's a GPS on this bird's back. It's positioned, it's sitting there almost like a backpack. So the straps go over and under the wing, and it kind of floats there among the feathers. It's about the size of a pack of Wrigley's gum, and depending on how it's programmed, we'll collect between 1 and 2 GPS locations a day for about a year. The trick with these is that I have to recapture the bird at some point in the future to plug that unit in to download the data. Now, given that these birds are long-lived, there's a record from Japan of an individual fish owl that's almost 30 years old. Because they don't really have natural predators because they're so large, and because they're territorial and can only hunt in a few places in winter, we figured the odds were pretty good that we'd be able to recapture these birds in the future. And that paid off. We were able to recapture all birds we tagged this way. I will say, though, that these units cost about $2,000, and I was raising all the funds for this work through small grants as a graduate student. And there's something about strapping $2,000 worth of tech to the back of a wild animal and then just letting it go. That definitely was a little anxiety inducing. So after the first season, Sergey and I had sort of worked out a capture methodology. We felt good about it, and we decided to get a little more serious. So we started driving around in this thing. It's a GAZ 66, which is a formidable Russian transport vehicle. This essentially has a 2-bedroom apartment, custom built on the back with a wood stove. You can see the stovepipe there. And so we drive this truck along that road network, revisiting sites that Sergey and I had found the year before, and really just work out of it. We park it next to the river, get a water from the river, fish out of the river, and try to catch the fish owls that lived in that area. We had this, over the years, we had this revolving cast of field assistants. Some stayed with us for just a few weeks, some stayed with us for a few seasons. It's actually quite difficult to find someone who is willing to spend 4 to 6 weeks at a time living in a truck in the middle of a winter with 2 to 4 other dudes trying to catch owls. So pickings were a little slim in some respects. And so this is what the gauze is like inside. It's pretty comfortable. I mean, if there were 2 people, maybe 3, this would be ideal. But 3 people would sleep on that rug space there. 2 more would sleep in the smaller room that's behind the photographer here. And it was tight. It's living in a sardine can with these other people. There's nowhere really to go. If you want to be warm, you have to be inside the truck, and no one's bathing because it's freezing outside. And so tensions would flare, aromas would mingle. And I was very much leading a double life during this period. I'd be get off a plane in Vladivostok, speak Russian for 3 months, be in the back of the gauze with Andrei and Shurik next to the Russian River. Then I'd go back to Vladivostok, get on a plane, get off to Minnesota, speak English for 9 months, and do normal things here, right? I'd go bowling, get married. I had a job at the Bell Museum looking at alligator gar. The next thing I know, I'd be back in a Russian truck with Andrei and Shurik looking for fish owls. And it was really, especially like this part of my life, the Russian part was difficult to explain to some of the people in my cohort in graduate school. People studying songbirds or rodents in Minnesota, just very vastly different field experiences than I did. It was sometimes hard to actually convey how different these experiences were. And so that's the benefit of the book, is so some of these people reading this book now and getting a better flavor for that. To underscore how remote we were and how on our own we were, this is Sergey's pickup truck. And here we've been driving along this old logging road, this old abandoned road that was, of course, hadn't been plowed and is rutted. And we punctured a tire. But because we were just bouncing along, the road is in such bad shape, we didn't know we had punctured the tire until it was completely flat. And we've been driving on it for quite some time. And the rubber actually became unseated from the rim, from the wheel. Now, typically, you need a device to get that back on there, which we didn't have. We're 80 kilometers here from the closest human settlement, which is a small hunting village. They probably didn't have what we needed. So realistically, we're hundreds of kilometers away here from help. And of course, there's no AAA. So I was very, very happy to have Sergey with me all these years, because he's essentially a professional woodsman, and he's gotten himself out of so many situations. This was just another one of them. So his solution to a problem here was to pour gasoline inside the rim of the tire and then set it on fire. The idea being that the resultant explosion would reseat the rubber. Oops. So I do have a quick video of that. And it worked. So once it was back on, we were able to, we found the hole, patch it, pump it up, and be on our way. So Sergey had been an engineer during the Soviet times, and then the factory he worked at just went bankrupt when the Soviet Union collapsed. And he kind of churned to the woods and never looked back. And he was absolutely essential to the success of this project. Here he is fixing the gauze, which was always in need of repairs. And I can say without too much hyperbole that it'd probably still be in the Russian woods somewhere, if not for Sergey's ability to fix the gauze, to fix the snowmobile, to fix the pickup truck, to know when to cross a flooded river, to know where to cross a flooded river, to know when to cross a mountain pass in a blizzard. Just really, really experienced, and was really key to the success of the work. So one thing I learned early on in this project is how important it is to be gracious to local inhabitants that we come across. We're working in a very remote area. We'd pass through a village with maybe just a few hundred people in it, stop at the store, buy fresh bread. Fresh Russian bread is amazing. It's one of the things I miss most about going to Russia, but every village has their own bakery. They make this great bread. So we'd stop in a village, get some fresh bread, maybe some beer and some cheese or something, and then drive through, stop, 20, 30, 50, 100 kilometers away at a fish house site and park there for a week or two. And so people from this village, they notice when someone new comes through, and someone might be up on the same river as us hunting or fishing, and they'd come back to town and say, oh, those guys that came through here? Yeah, they're up there. I don't know what they're doing though. And so eventually someone will get curious enough to approach us and just want to know what we're doing. So here's Sergey. Sergey has the headlamp and he has his arm around Shurik. The other two, the two guys on the right, they just knocked on our door at about 1 o'clock in the morning, knocked on the door of the truck. And I was like, hey, who are you guys? What are you doing here? Do you want to drink with us? Now, my natural inclination would be to tell them to beat it. But again, it was really important to not make enemies of people that live nearby. And this is a great reason why, right? I mean, because it's so remote, if we had told those kids to beat it the night before, and then our car goes through the river and we need someone with a winch to help us out, and those guys come by, they're not going to help us if we dismiss them. But if we were friendly, if we were engaging, they do everything they can. If they didn't have a winch, they'd send someone back to the closest human settlement to get one. And so over the years, Sergey and I have cultivated this network of local contacts. And we'll go into a village and say, okay, we're trying to get to this fish out territory. Are any of the bridges out? Or sometimes hunters will give us meat, or people will bring us fish. And it's a two-way street. And I bring them hunting equipment and camping gear that they just simply don't have access to. I bring that stuff over from the US. So here's the question, who cares? Why does any of this matter? Really matter? And this is the stuff that I did 10, 15 years ago, running around the Russian woods chasing owls. Well, again, remember that road network, that map that I showed you? This is what that looks like on the ground. So because of the how mountainous the region is with the Sakhalin Mountains, most of the roads are laid in the river valleys. You can see that the dirt track here crossing this broad river valley in the frozen river. And so here we look at these are fish owl territories from the backs of the fish owls. So not only are all the roads in river valleys, so are all the fish owls. Something like 0.14% of the several thousand GPS locations we got from these birds were outside of a valley. So there's 5 birds here. It's hard to tell. I know there's 2 pairs and a single male up there in the north, that light blue. But hey, this is what conservation is, right? It's finding solutions to these complex problems, solutions that benefit both people and wildlife, and use scientific data to do so. So most of these roads are logging roads. I mean, logging is the backbone of the economy there. Most of these little villages we go through, if people in that village work, they're probably working for one of the logging companies. And what's important about this is that wood from Primordia's forest, it makes it to North America. It goes to Europe as flooring. People also use these roads to access rivers and the coast for fishing. Some of it is recreational, sure, but there's a tremendous amount of commercial fishing. There's a number of salmon species here. And it's also a really important part of the economy. And fish from Primordia's waters is sold throughout Asia. So how these natural resources are used and managed by humans, it matters to fish owls, but it also matters on a global scale. So if the trees and fish are harvested here sustainably, we benefit from it, as do the owls. So like a good graduate student, I defended my dissertation, came up with some conservation recommendations, and then published those results. Now, I feel particularly lucky because unlike many of the people I went to graduate school with, I still work where I did my graduate research. I know plenty of folks who did graduate work either here in Minnesota or elsewhere in the country, and then got a job somewhere entirely different, working on an entirely different tax and an entirely different system. So, but because I'm still working there, I'm actually able to implement some of the conservation recommendations that the Sergeys and I came up with. And so the first thing we did with the GPS data was create a predictive map showing the highest quality fish owl habitat across our 20,000 square kilometer study area. And we gave that map to the logging company that has the rights to log in all these lands. And essentially, whereas before they didn't have any documents to refer to when taking endangered species protection into account, now they do. Anytime they want to put a new road into a river valley, for example, they have this document they can refer to that shows, okay, this side of the river valley has this great fish habitat, we'll put our road in on the other side. And typically the valleys are wide enough that that's not a conflict. Another thing we're doing with this data is identifying high biodiversity areas along that massive road network. So places that aren't just good for fish owls, but also good bear habitat, tiger habitat, boar habitat, and then working with the logging company each year to close a selection of these roads. They don't close the main roads as we'd like, and the roads don't always stay closed as long as we'd like, but by putting up a big berm like this, you are at least for part of the year restricting access. And if you're restricting access, you're making those forests safe for fish owls and other wildlife. Then the final conservation intervention is something that came a little bit later. Sergey and I we've been monitoring these fish owl territories for more than a decade. And there's one territory that we had monitored for a decade, and we discovered that they were just blowing through nest trees. So, it takes 200-300 years for a nest tree to be big enough to sustain a fish owl. But our data are showing that it might only be suitable as a fish owl nest tree then for between 2 and 4 years. Because they're so big and they're old and they're rotting, they're susceptible to the seasonal typhoons, and the typhoons are getting stronger. So nest trees are just getting knocked over. There's a tree that Sergey's up there on the right. The cavity is still there. It's decayed down so deep now that the owls can't get in and out of it comfortably, and so it was abandoned as a nesting site. So this one territory that we visited for a decade, we watched them go through 4 nest trees in that period of time. And in 2015, we went back and the owls were there. They were vocalizing, but they weren't breeding, and they weren't breeding because it wasn't a nest tree. So we took a cue from our colleagues in Japan who have been erecting these nest boxes since the early 1980s. It's had a massive difference. Fish owls in Japan have doubled their populations in the early 80s because of very, very aggressive conservation measures, with the nest boxes being an important part of it. Now in Japan, when researchers want to put up a new nest box, it's a custom order. There's a company that custom molds these things. There's an entrance hole that's lined with oak, and it costs, it's either $1,200 or $1,400. It's a lot for a nest box. Sergey and I went to the market and got a good deal on about a dozen of these things for about $20 each. These are 55-gallon-ish drums that used to have soybean oil in them. Cleaned them out, took one of them, painted it, cut a hole in the side, attached a perch, and drove about 9 hours from Sergey's home up to this site, and put it up in a tree, kind of near where an old nest tree had been, and sort of near the river. We put a camera trap up there just to see, an infrared camera trap, to see if the owls would find it, and if they did, what would they do? They found it in about a week and a half. And so since 2015, the resident pair there has nested multiple times, and they've fledged multiple chicks. So the whole story, I'm involved in a lot of different work now, all across Asia, as Sue mentioned in the introduction. And so fish owls is maybe 5% of my overall job now. I'm still working with the Sergeys. Every year we try to get out. I think when I was talking to Sue last year about the book, I was missing the fish owl field season because of COVID. Sergeys were out looking for owls. They're going to go out again in May. At this point, I probably won't be able to go. But it's this project means the most to me. I feel like wildlife conservation, like many professions, it's filled with uncertainty. People like me can spend our entire careers designing studies and collecting data and using that information to guide conservation, but sometimes it's hard to know if our efforts have any real impact. So knowing that right now there are fish owls flapping around Primordia, because Sergey and I have strapped barrels to trees, because we're working collaboratively with loggers to reduce the harm of that industry, it feels good. Although I'll say the owls don't always appreciate our efforts. All right. Well, hey, that's what I have. Thank you for your attention, and I hope there's some time for questions.
I have a question.
Hi, Beth.
Hi. Thanks for coming and talking with us.
Uh-huh.
I have heard that there are GPS satellite-driven tracking mechanisms now that are being used. Are you going to get an opportunity to give any of those a try?
Well, I'm hoping pretty soon to start looking and see what kind of technologies are available. I mean, I haven't used any kind of tracking device in a decade, and I mean, things were changing year by year when I was doing this, so I imagine things are really different now 10 years later. A limitation, and something that that is discussed in the book is that usually to transmit, there has to be an external antenna of some kind. So the data loggers we used, they only have an internal antenna that receives GPS data. Now, to transmit, you need this external antenna, and fish owls are really good at ripping off external antennas. And you know, it doesn't do anybody any good to go through all the effort of catching a bird if you're going to get essentially no information out of it. So yeah, I do want to do another research project coming up here that uses transmitters, but I need to see what kind of external antennas there are and how durable they are, I guess.
Yeah, I remember reading that part in the book when those antennas were getting ripped up and feeling for you.
Yeah. Yeah, so hopefully things have gotten better. Something that people use all over the world now with great success is transmitters that connect into the cellular network. And unfortunately, that doesn't quite work here either because there's no cell coverage. I don't have a single owl territory that's close enough to a cellular network for that to work.
I have a question for you, and that is, it sounds like you have a good team over there to help you and research assistants. And what about any younger people? Are you able to bring in and sort of mentor any younger people?
Not really, and that's a problem. That's a long-standing problem. It's not just a owl thing or a bird thing. It's kind